In our first time together, and I'm happy you're here with me again, we asked whether there could be a question about the meaning of life that would be an important one to ask. And we've also begun our consideration of whether philosophy might have something to say about that question of the meaning of life. And we made a distinction between philosophy as a technical discipline and philosophy as perhaps a way of offering guidance in living. Let's consider and continue our reflections together. In the axial mode, which we met before, human life is understood as involving a journey in which those who are successful move from a lower realm to a higher realm. And it's this journey that gets understood as central to the meaning of life. Whatever the meaning of life is, this journey, this axial journey from appearance to reality, from this realm to another, from bondage to liberation, is very, very important. What was thought through the axial mind was that some elevated way of knowing the world as we ordinarily experienced it maybe could be left temporarily behind, and that the world as we ordinarily know it could be viewed as lesser, could be viewed, if not as illusory, and yet not quite as the domain of reality itself when reality came to be approached. And in fact, the philosophy of Plato and Platonism generally kind of exemplifies this way of thinking. Often a quite disciplined, non-mystical, analytical, even conceptual training was construed by this axial mind, at least among its philosophers, as a prerequisite, as an important thing to do in order for the ultimate kind of knowledge sought to be found. And ultimate knowledge was typically understood as both transformative and, in many instances, it was also understood to be incommunicable. The lower realm was construed as an arena of bondage, and the bondage could be construed either as a consequence of ignorance of what the higher realities actually are, or sometimes it was construed as the result of an enslavement to various passions that would confuse and distract us. Supposedly, in a sustained contact with reality, we're understood to have become liberated, one with our true selves, and thus to have become who we really are. And only if we become who we really are, it was thought, could we have attained or be in the vicinity of the meaning of life. To have become our true selves was viewed on this axial model as to have become good. And to be in this sense good was said to bring happiness. Now, this happiness would indicate that life's meaning has been found, or we were close to finding it, though the happiness would not itself be construed as the meaning of life. A symptom of nearing it, but not the meaning of life itself. Now, a significant and pivotal distinction comes to be made between living in confusion, however unwittingly, and the attaining of a special insight that was in fact often called enlightenment. Not enlightenment in the 18th century sense that we referred to before, but a special insight or enlightenment at the end of the axial journey. Now, this insight could often take the form of something that was fleeting and even get experienced as in some ways baffling. And for some, what the initial enlightenment or insight would do would be just to reorient the traveler on the axial journey. And the life of Socrates actually provides a kind of paradigmatic example of this kind of initial insight. It's a curious story. He was in fact told he was the wisest of all the Athenians. He didn't see this to be the case at all, but having been told that, reoriented him. He came to question whether he really was wise, and in Athens began asking questions that set him on his path to the discovery that, in fact, well, controversially so, maybe truly he was the wisest person in Athens and in touch with a higher realm. And it's also true that Hindu gurus who become dispellers of darkness often say that earlier in their lives they have a kind of strange experience that reorients them and turns them on the path to a final enlightenment. Final and sustainable insight, revelation, enlightenment is typically construed as involving an arduous discipline and as having as a consequence the viewing of the ordinary and the everyday world quite differently. The enlightenment that comes is not necessarily just seeing something else. It's also seeing the ordinary world now being enlightened in an extraordinary way. The axial understanding of life is always involved in a kind of pervasive ocular imagery, and that's been part of our religious heritage and part of philosophy as well. The quest is always construed as moving out of darkness, the bad, into light, which is construed as the good. And sight, visual sighting, has been given a priority in philosophy that's tended to make philosophical modes of enlightenment and philosophical guidance primarily matters of the intellect. In terms of the axial model, and it's hard to kind of finally make sense of this, the realm of light is viewed as unchanging, it's viewed as reliable, and finally as the foundation for all human wisdom and successful activity. Light, liberation, and reality come to fuse. They come to be one and the same, and they come to be seen as the hidden foundation of everything. And to reach that was viewed as salvation, as having found the meaning of life itself. Now, paradoxically, and it is a paradox, the enlightenment of the 18th century, not enlightenment as something that comes at the end of the axial journey, but the enlightenment of the 18th century was a watershed event in the Western world. And so contrary to the traditional older view of enlightenment, that of enlightenment as a transforming insight that was embodied and understood within the axial picture, this new notion of enlightenment is a notion of getting enlightened through reason. Not a revelatory intuition that one got through reason and got into another realm, but a notion of reason that got very much focused into this world. In terms of that 18th century notion of reason, what had been offered as wisdom was now construed most typically as the remains of superstition, as something that belonged to the church, viewed negatively, or to the priestly class. And frequently some higher enlightened notion of knowing was debunked, was viewed as simply mystification, or a kind of a disguised means of reaffirming and protecting the privileges of various elite groups. Higher knowledge was often construed as the stale residue of traditions and customs no longer relevant to the then modern world of the 18th century. And in fact, the empirical sciences came to be taken as the paradigms of knowing, sciences that would know this world. And gradually, and this takes a number of centuries to work itself out, and it comes to our time, humans themselves came increasingly to be viewed as proper objects of scientific knowledge. And humans slowly, yet progressively, came to be viewed as altogether in this world and not of any other world, except in the very most extended and metaphorical sense. Knowledge came more and more to be coupled with power and was construed as an instrument for controlling the world, not as a means of transcending this world and its ordinariness, not as a means of undertaking a journey to some higher realm. Liberation became more and more a concern with freedom from interference as one went about what one did in this world. And it became less and less liberation in the sense of finding a way to be liberated to go on a journey that would take one to the discovery of one's true self. And in fact, the qualitative notion of transforming fulfillment eroded. It eroded in the face of the notion of a quantitative pursuit of pleasures that, in fact, were to be found in this world. So, if you think about this for a moment before we move on, there is a notion of reason we inherit. It's an axial notion of reason as a means of taking a journey to a higher form of life and enlightenment. But a notion of reason replaces this in the 18th century, in the 18th century period that is also called an enlightenment, and that new notion of reason is a notion of reason that is directed toward this world, finding means how to control this world, and in the course of that, liberating oneself to be more and more able to pursue the things of this world. We now come to the philosopher Kant, who is very clearly the watershed thinker that will influence a great deal how we come to reflect on these matters. Kant lived from 1724 to 1804, and he can be seen as an attempt to reconcile the dynamics and hopes of this axial mentality that construed life as a journey toward what might be thought of as the meaning of life. Kant tried to reconcile that with the opportunities that were being made available through developing modern science. Kant distinguishes between two distinct and equally important understandings of a discipline called metaphysics, both of which he claims to be vital to our comprehension of our human futures. We should dwell on this for a moment because the notion of metaphysics is a very, very important notion for us to get a grasp of. Metaphysics was construed by the philosophical tradition as the pursuit of that which is beyond this world. The Greek word meta has as one of its meanings beyond. And of course the question would be, can there be a pursuit that is metaphysical? Can there be a pursuit that would take us beyond the physical world? Well, Kant in his own reflections distinguished two notions of metaphysics. One was metaphysics as a science, which meant a systematic organization of a kind of knowledge you could get through directly encountering things. But Kant thought that that notion of metaphysics, that we would have scientific metaphysics based on an encounter with things beyond the physical world, he thought that was impossible because he thought reason could not reach beyond the physical world. It could reach no metaphysical world. So in that sense, Kant tells us that metaphysics as a science, metaphysics as a study of a scientific type that would give us encounter and knowledge of things beyond the physical world, was impossible because he said reason simply couldn't reach beyond the physical world. But Kant did not necessarily deny that there was something beyond the physical world. He didn't deny that there could be a truth to the axial mentality. To say that metaphysics couldn't be a science is not to say that there may not be something beyond the physical world. And Kant, in fact, regarding that, was in a curious, almost coy way at times, agnostic. What he said was that he was limiting reason to make room for faith. And what that meant for him, let's pause on it for a moment, what that meant for him was that he was showing that reason could not stretch beyond the physical world, but if it couldn't stretch beyond the physical world, it couldn't know whether there was anything beyond the physical world. It could neither prove that there was or prove that there wasn't. And if you showed reason couldn't prove there was or there wasn't, you had limited reason's reach. And then Kant could say, and having done that, I've left room for faith. Kant does have another understanding of metaphysics, an important understanding that will be at the core of our reflections as we consider whether it makes sense to talk about life having a meaning and whether it makes sense talking about philosophy as a guide, as a way of pursuing whether life has a meaning and what that meaning might be. Because Kant also understands metaphysics as a natural disposition of the human soul. And it exhibits itself in the unavoidable urge he claims that we have to ask questions regarding our human nature, regarding our destiny as human beings, regarding whether there may be a power or powers beyond the physical world, and whether there may be a kind of grand intelligibility to the universe as a whole. What Kant says is that to be fully human, you have to be asking these questions. And if you think about it for a moment, this is strange. We can only use reason. Reason cannot reach beyond the physical world, but we are only fully human. We're really only human beings if nonetheless, in the face of the inability of the one instrument we have, reason, we nonetheless continue to ask these questions. We continue to ask, what is the meaning of life? Is there a power beyond us? What is the ultimate destiny of our soul, if we have one, or of our life after our death? And does the totality of the cosmos fit into some intelligible order? So Kant's telling us we've got to be rational. And if we're fully rational, we do find that reason is limited. Not only do we have to be fully rational, we have to realize reason is our one hope. He then tells us that it can extend just so far that the questions that matter are beyond its reach, but these questions we have to ask anyway. Now, following tradition, Kant claims that there are but two avenues through which we can know. One we've already looked at. That's reason. The other avenue is our senses, our sensibility. Now, Kant understands reason as, among other things, a means of interpreting, never reaching beyond the world, but interpreting what we experience in the world, but certainly not capable of revealing reality without distortion. And as we've seen, Kant also claims that reason generates ideas that he believes to be inescapable and not rationally resolvable. The cognitive legacy of Kant is to give comfort to the axial mind, yet to deny that humans can have rational insight into any metaphysical realities now. As a result, philosophy now bifurcates, it splits into an analytical investigation of concepts. Kant thinks that philosophy can serve science, and philosophy can also analyze concepts that are used in all areas of our life. And philosophy then separately, and in this strange way that can't be satisfying if satisfaction means finding provable answers, philosophy can also reflect, as supposedly we must if we're to be fully human, on questions regarding meaning. A central question arises in the midst of this. How and what kind of human freedom might fit into a scientific understanding of how our life is lived only in the world? And Kant gives a great deal of reflection, which we are going to be concerning ourselves with, as to how our life in the world, about which he thinks we can know a great deal, accommodates the need we have and the assumption that we make that we are truly free beings. Kant comes to be very concerned with how to understand freedom, and if our rational mind can only deal directly with the world that we find ourselves in, this world, how can we sort out what freedom is like and what its rational features are? Further questions arise regarding how philosophy might actually provide guidance for living under the circumstances that Kant outlines. Let me give you a few examples of this that I think will clarify further what we're going to be looking at together. I hope you'll notice that I said that Kant believed there were two avenues, and only two avenues by means of which we could hope to know reality. One we've looked at, and that is reason. The other, Kant said, is our senses. But now, what does Kant say about our senses? What Kant tells us is that our senses are tied to physical things and can only reveal physical things. Well, that means that we don't have an extrasensory sense that might allow us to leap out and beyond the world we find ourselves in, leap out beyond it and find a metaphysical reality. You see, the entire Western tradition that we are so caught up in believes that it's our senses that allow us to see the world, but we have no sense that allows us to see anything that would be viewed as beyond the world. Someone might rightly ask, and some of the philosophers we are going to be looking at after Kant are going to suggest that quite possibly we have some extra sense, a sense that is not simply tied to this world, but allows us in some way to go beyond this world. Unfortunately, the tradition, and Kant simply is the culmination of this tradition, tells us that we have no such sense. It's just simply not available to us. And therefore, what he offers us is the notion of these unanswerable questions that even our senses, and then that implies what scientific investigation could provide in the way of knowledge for us, even our senses and our scientific knowledge couldn't reach. He says that we have to ask, do we have a soul? Does this have a soul after we die? That's a special metaphysical question that we simply can't avoid. He says that we have to ask. We can't get around asking. We experience it even if we try to mute it. Is there a power somehow beyond us? A power, now the traditional word for that would be God. Is there a power beyond us to which we might enter into a relationship? What might that relationship be, and what would that tell us about what our life might be like after this life we are living ends? And Kant also says, however speculative it is, we cannot help but ask questions about how the universe began. We can't help but ask questions about where the universe might be going. We must be modern people. We must live in a world where we realize that science gives us what knowledge we can receive, but nonetheless, we just cannot at all get away from these other questions. Do I have something about me that lives beyond this physical life? Is there a power beyond me? Not an indifferent power, but a power in relation to which whatever happens to me after this life will be determined. Am I just a chance occurrence in the universe? Or is there an origin to the universe, a destiny and direction to it, and I've got to understand what this origin and what this destiny are if I'm even to understand my place, my circumstance, my meaning in life. Having limited reason, what Kant comes finally to say is that there are three fundamental questions that we absolutely have to ask. What can I truly and finally know? Given the limits of my reason, what, as a human being, ought I then do based on how little or how much I am able to know? What ought I do as a human being living in this world? And Kant offers as the final question, for what, when all is said and done, can I hope? What genuine, realistic hope can I have for my life? And he concludes that if you take those three questions, what can I know? What ought I do? And for what might I hope? And you fuse them together, they're really one question. What does it mean to be human? And you can only begin to be human if you ask what it means to be human. We'll look into Kant a bit further as we continue on our journey together.